This, despite the unusual times in which we find ourselves. I would also like to thank our speakers for making time to join us today to speak on this very important topic. You would all agree with me that with COVID-19 happening, the internet has proven to be more and more important than we ever even thought. And it is one of the main means of ensuring continuity in both offline, in continuity of both offline and online activities. And then before we delve into the discussion, I just want to give a brief highlight of what we'll be speaking on this session. So for the next 1.5 hours, we'll be discussing the topic, the fight to keep it on, despite increased kill switches around the world. You would agree with me that this is a very, very important topic. Again, given the context we currently live in, some of you might be wondering why a government would shut down the internet in the first place, and what do they stand to gain from that? Over the years, governments are increasingly weaponizing the use of internet shutdowns or kill switches or slowdowns or throttling or social media blackouts, among others, to silence dissenting voices. Most governments order these shutdowns during elections, protests, school exams, or crises, citing national security concerns, the need to prevent the spread of false information or hate speech, or preventing students from cheating in exams, among others. Yet having monitored the impact of internet shutdowns on people's lives, on human rights, on the economy, one thing is clear, that internet shutdowns do not solve the problems that governments tend to cite as justification for these shutdowns. So in this session, we are going to look at how the fight against internet shutdowns continues as we see an increase in governments also hitting the kill switch at any given time. So I would let my speakers introduce themselves briefly, tell us your name, your organization or institution, where you are joining us from, and any interesting thing you would want us to know about you regarding your life online. And then we can delve into the conversation after the introductions. So I would start with Tomiwa. Kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Felicia, for that brief introduction. So my name is Tomiwa Ilori, and I'm a doctoral researcher at the Center for Human Rights. I also work with the Center of Human Rights Faculty of Law, University of Pretoria. I also work with the Expression, Information and Digital Rights Unit, where I also carry out some research projects. My area of thesis that I'm focused on is it looks at the free speech perspective to digital colonialism and how that impacts on freedom of expression, especially within the region in Africa. Then also looking to some sort of a right-respecting approach to platform governance in the region. So that would be it from me as a form of introduction. And okay, maybe before I joined the center, I worked with a couple of organizations, especially on issues of digital rights and specifically on internet shutdowns. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Devduta, can you take the mic?
Hello, everyone. My name is Devduta, and I work as an Associate Litigation Counsel at Internet Freedom Foundation, which is a digital rights organization based in India. As Felicia said, we're here today to discuss the kill switch of internet shutdowns. And when it comes to that issue, there's really no country which is quite as trigger happy as the Indian government. So operating in that kind of a particular political environment where your government has imposed the highest number of internet shutdowns in the world, we definitely think dealing with arbitrary and prolonged government-ordered shutdowns is a top policy priority for us at Internet Freedom Foundation. So a lot of our work has focused on that. In particular, I'm a litigation counsel, and I worked on successive rounds of litigation before the Supreme Court of India regarding the internet restrictions in Jammu and Kashmir, which is a border state in India where internet restrictions have been imposed for over a year. So that's some of the issues that I hope to talk about today and delve deeper into during the discussion. And I think that's enough for now, and I'm really excited to hear more from the other panelists.
Thank you very much. Yasin, kindly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Felicia, and to my fellow speakers, and welcome to everyone. My name is Yasin Osman. I'm a Sudanese South African human rights lawyer and recent graduate from the Irish Centre for Human Rights at the National University of Ireland, Galway, which is where I'm based at the moment. I'm primarily a researcher on internet shutdowns, particularly on their impact on freedom of expression and assembly, and how it is a violation of international law, and how prolonged internet shutdowns lead to the political suppression of civil society and the marginalization of minorities and ethnic communities, the more prolonged and targeted it becomes. So yes, so that's my particular focus on internet shutdowns. I'm also exploring its socio-political impact on communities beyond the law. Thank you.
Thank you, Hija.
Hello, everybody. My name is Hija Kamran, and I am a digital rights and internet governance advocacy lead at Media Matters for Democracy, which is a Pakistan-based non-for-profit organization that works on media freedoms and digital rights in the country. Our primary focus has been to defend freedom of expression in the country, which also involves strategic litigation, again, to challenge governments' censorship attempts or internet shutdowns attempts, and a lot of other attempts of marginalizing or curbing rights in the country that the government keeps taking. So my primary focus has been around advocacy, and we also basically have our legal team that supports the strategic litigation efforts that the organization does.
Okay, awesome. And my name is Felicia Antonio. I work with Access Now as a Keep It On campaign lead. And Keep It On is a global campaign that unites over 230 organizations around the world. And we work to fight internet shutdowns globally. And you'll get to know most of the speakers on this panel are members of the Keep It On coalition, and you'll get to know the amazing work that they've been doing over the years in order to hold governments accountable. So before we start the conversation, I just want to highlight the impact that internet shutdowns have on people's lives. And we've received incidents in which people have lost educational opportunities, professional opportunities. They've been disconnected with their families and loved ones due to government-created internet shutdowns. And so there's a story that we received recently from Chad. If you are aware, there's an ongoing disruption of WhatsApp. WhatsApp is blocked in Chad. And I just want to read this story to start, kick off the conversation. I am an independent consultant. I earn my income through the internet. This shutdown has seriously harmed both my offline activities and my online consultancies, which can be valued at 3,500 euros. I missed a job opportunity in the sub-region, specifically Yaoundé, simply because I could not connect to take the interview on the date indicated. And the deadline for application is over. It's a shame. These and many are the stories we receive whenever a government decides to shut down the internet, just because they have the power to do so. Increasingly, internet shutdowns are being used to target vulnerable groups. They are lasting longer. As you heard, Jeff, there's been a shutdown that started last year, and it's still happening in India. And they're affecting more and more people. And with the outbreak of COVID-19, which has emphasized the crucial importance of internet access in people's lives, from education, health, activism, businesses, and journalism. And governments have also advised us to avoid public spaces in order to curtail the spread of the virus. And this and many more has resulted in offline activities being moved entirely online. Yet, unfortunately, certain populations have been deliberately disconnected from the rest of the world by their governments, denying them access to information about the COVID-19 virus, and thereby putting their lives at risk. I would let Tomiwa come in to shed more light on a research that he's currently working on the impact of internet shutdowns and how it's affecting people in Africa. So over to you, Tomiwa.
Thank you so much, Felicia, for that background. I'm going to be riding on your coattails, especially with respect to how internet shutdown, specifically, practically impact on lives, especially in the region. So just to speak briefly about the research Felicia just mentioned. So I'm currently working on a commissioned research from the Global Network Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder organization that looks to bring major stakeholders on issues of how technologies impact human rights across the globe. Basically, there's a lot of literature out there, a lot of projects, a lot of ideas that have been designed towards measuring and understanding the impact of internet shutdowns, especially across the world. But this particular research looks at the social aspect of it, and what is being intended with respect to the social aspect of it is that what are the lived realities of people who are being impacted by these shutdowns? Understandably, the conversation has always revolved around the civil and political and socioeconomic aspects. But on the ground, the woman who needs financial services in the rural areas to transport our farm produces to the township does not necessarily know about civil and political rights, right? They also don't know about socioeconomic rights. They just know that today, the government woke up and said there's no internet access, and that to them is a problem. So in the research, what we're looking at is the real life experiences of people who live through these shutdowns and what opportunities must have been missed, just like Felicia earlier pointed from the examples she shared. So based on preliminary feedback from interviewees and also existing literature that abounds on the subject, you discover that when you come to the region, so far, not less than at least 26 countries have carried out internet shutdowns since 2007, when Lassana Conte, the president of Guinea then, first started, initiated an internet shutdown due to an election issue. So since then, we've seen that African governments have become, copycats, especially in that respect, carrying out shutdowns, when it is justified and when it is not. But contextually applying the issues in the region, you discover that even at the international level, then also at the regional level, what the laws say is, I'll be given specific examples here. For example, if you look at the provisions of the International Telecommunications Union Constitution, it says that countries have the right, based on national security, to cut telecommunication access at some point. Then if you step down a little bit to the African region, you see there's a guidelines on elections guidelines on access to information and election, which also provides for internet shutdowns and states clearly it's only in instances where it is justified under international law. Now, applying that contextually, what does that mean? If I am, for example, a president of a country in the region, what do you mean by saying it has to apply, international law needs to apply? Fine, on the surface of it, it needs to be legitimate, it needs to be legal, it needs to be necessary. But what does that mean specifically when I'm being faced with a very valid national security concern? So with that respect, looking at the preliminary research so far, it discovered that while the international law perspective of the issue is fairly defined, it doesn't speak specifically to how stakeholders, especially governments, can take charge of instances where they need to apply international law standards to internet shutdowns. That's one. Number two, another contextual issue, especially when it comes to the region and internet shutdowns, are internet penetration. The African region has one of the lowest internet penetration rates. So, but when we speak of internet shutdowns in this part of the world, we speak of it as if 100% of everyone has been affected. But what this research has shown so far is that whether it is 40% or 100%, internet shutdowns hurt everyone. And I will give an example from a certain contributor to a certain interviewee. The person stated clearly that in some communities where he comes from, cutting access to radio communication could be more dire, could be more impactful compared to cutting internet access. Why? There was no internet access in the first place. But when you look at it more critically, you discover that as it is tradition in every part, almost all parts of the world, right? When you for example, when you live in the townships and you have people back home in the rural areas who you are responsible for. And for example, your livelihood in the township is based on internet access. And at the end of the day, because you're part of the 40% in the region that has internet access, you are caught short you're victim of the internet shutdown. And because your livelihood depends on that access, you're unable to, for example, remit support back home. So whether it is radio connection or internet access back in the rural areas, you still discover that at the end of the day, when you look at the value chain of internet shutdowns, at the end of the day, the person in the township is unable to earn livelihood, to be able to remit support back home. And at the end of the day, both people living in urban areas and in the rural areas are affected. So at the end of the day, no one gains from internet shutdowns. So these are some of the contextual challenges and issues that the preliminary research that on the social impact of internet shutdowns are currently revealing. Also, there's also the challenge, right? On, like I said earlier, when governments do have valid reason to, want to contain a certain national security issue. And I'll give an example. Recently in Ethiopia, there were very many calls by civil society actors, by many major stakeholders on how hate speech that translates to offline harms, hate speech online that translates to offline harms in these countries are rife. For example, on platforms like Facebook. In that kind of instance, as a civil society person sitting on the other side of the seat, what would we have to say to the government who has to grapple with such a national security concern? So, the research right now is constantly now opening up the conversation on the need to have a more specific approach, maybe a set of guidelines that is multi-stakeholder in a sense that speaks to how government needs to address based on the patterns in the past. For example, like Felicia mentioned, there have been instances of school examination where government used school examination as excuses. There's been instances of national security. There have been instances that, where it is not even, they are just technical cuts from maybe a submarine cut somewhere, or there's a non-state actor, a terrorist attack on infrastructure, all of that. So depending on the context, depending on the issue at hand, or depending on the instance of internet shutdown, how do government and other stakeholders need to approach internet shutdown? So that is one of the issues or some of the issues that the research is also trying to tease out, to look at how these disruptions contextually impact and how we can effectively, going forward, advocate a right-based approach in that instance. So, and also to speak quickly that the interviews are still going on, and for example, I'll be sharing a link to the survey in the chat. So if you know someone, or if you, for example, especially if you're based in the region, in African region, and you've experienced shutdown at some point, it will be very great to hear a perspective on how it has affected you, not necessarily especially beyond the human rights speak. The civil, political, and socioeconomic framings, but exactly how it affected your life. Were you unable to get medical supplies due to these shutdowns? Like Felicia explained, someone actually lost a huge economic opportunity. I mean, what are these lived experiences? So these are some of the issues that the research seeks to tease out. So I'll be pasting the link shortly. And thank you so much for listening.
Thank you very much, Tomiwa, for that insight. It's always important for researchers like you to keep highlighting the impact of these extreme measures being adopted by governments in violating people's rights. And so we have another PhD candidate or student on the panel. It's an honor to have both of you, and I will let Yasin speak after you, because his research also ties into impact of internet shutdowns on various international rights. And yeah, let me give you the floor to highlight the findings of your research. And
thank you, Felicia, and thank you, Tomiwa. I would first begin on how I went about doing my research, and that was through a comparative study of the 3 continents that experience internet shutdowns the most, being Asia, Africa, and Europe. And increasingly, you are seeing a rise across all 3 continents. So the research focuses on the legislation that has been enacted that enables governments to shut down the internet, as well as the court's cases that challenged those internet shutdowns. So from that research, I tried to elicit the purpose and the intention behind internet shutdowns, and then the actual effects of it from an international human rights law perspective. So there were 5 findings that I reached. And first and foremost, most important thing to state is that internet shutdowns are completely prohibited by international law in terms of the ICCPR, Article 19 and Article 21, which protect freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. You have David Kaye, the UN Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and opinion, in 2015 stating that there is a complete prohibition on internet kill switches because they are disproportionate, because they are unnecessary. They don't achieve the purpose of which it sets out to achieve. And this includes during times of conflict and during times of states of emergency. There's no circumstance under which you can implement an internet shutdown. So that was the first finding. The second finding is that when you actually delve deeper into internet shutdowns, you find that its origin was actually from its military use against insurgents within a country. When a state was engaging in military combats with insurgents, they would disrupt the internet in order to disorientate military operations. So when you have that as the origin of internet shutdowns, it becomes easy to see that when a government implements an internet shutdowns, it views those people using the internet as enemies of the state, a threat to the government itself. So that is a major indication of why internet shutdowns are used. So you've seen that as recently as in Syria against the Assad government who has implemented that. You've seen it in Northern Ireland. So yeah. And the third finding is that there is an increase in legislation that is enabling internet shutdowns, particularly to combat fake news. And because fake news is such an abstract idea, because you can't easily define it, the governments have taken that sort of margin, that leeway, to essentially shut down the internet whenever there is any opinion or protest that is critical of the government, that says something that goes against the government's statements, and as such they would categorize that as fake news. You see this in Turkey particularly, where it's stated that where the government states that the legislation, the recent internet law, is intended to combat fake news, but the actual targets of the law are academics, or secularists, or anti-governmental critics, those that are voicing political opinions. You have their websites being shut down, or during protests you have internet shutdowns limiting that ability to communicate. So you see that the real targets behind internet shutdowns are those that are critical of the government. The fourth point is the actual effects that internet shutdowns have over the short term and over the long term. Over the short term, when it comes to protesting, there are particular effects that it has. Firstly, governments shut down the internet during protests in order to disorientate protesters. Because social media connectivity has enabled the ability to impart and receive and impart information, and has allowed civil society greater access to truth, there's a greater need to hold governments accountable, and that is done through protest actions. So the myth among governments is that once you remove social media, once you remove the internet, that will stop the protests. But instead, the reason for protests isn't because of social media connectivity, it's because of deep-rooted societal issues that the government has been unable, unwilling to fix. So they resort to cutting off the internet to disorganize protesters. Another purpose is that when the government fails to disrupt protests, they go through it through other means by committing human rights atrocities. And then you disrupt the internet to cover up those atrocities. You've seen that in Sudan after the Khartoum massacre in 2019, where over almost 200 people were killed by military forces, and the week following, the government shut down the internet with the purpose of disrupting from making sure that people don't send videos and photos of killings. But that's not what actually happens. It's entirely unnecessary, because after you bring the internet back, those videos, those photos are going to resurface again, and you'd still have the atrocities out there. The purpose isn't, as purported by states, that it's for national security reasons. It is sometimes to cover up the tracks of governments attempting to disrupt protests. Over the long term, the longer an internet shutdown goes on, the more targeted it becomes, the more entrenched the problems become. For example, you've seen this in Balochistan, in Pakistan, in Kashmir, and particularly in Rakhine State. Marginalization. For example, in Rakhine State, the Rohingya Muslims are placed into townships. They're segregated from the rest of society. And in my thesis, I've compared this to the Bantustans of South Africa, where Black communities were pushed to the outskirts of cities to segregate them from the rest of society. So not only now, so you have this physical segregation of an ethnic minority within a country. So, but on top of that, now you are implementing geo-targeted internet shutdowns for those particular townships, to ensure that those communities cannot speak out, cannot communicate with other communities, cannot communicate with the rest of society, to engage in conversation, to form their own civil societies, to challenge the state. So you have a form of digital suppression, and it's what inspired the title of my thesis, is that you have a digital apartheid, because you are effectively removing them from the rest of society. And that's where increased hate will bubble. When you fail to have a dialogue with that community, you just see a simmering of increased hate. And this is what has led to, again, the UN Special Rapporteur, David Kay, comparing internet shutdowns to collective punishments. It fulfills the criteria of collective punishments, which is in fact a war crime. It goes against international humanitarian law and international criminal law, because it indiscriminately punishes. It's a punitive measure that punishes an entire population for the actions of individuals. So increasingly, the most important thing that governments are trying to do now is to normalize internet shutdowns, which is something that cannot occur, because you would have a slew of human rights violations that will follow it. And it will lead to a denial of existence for minorities and othering of those communities to the rest of society. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And that is very true. Anytime governments impose internet shutdowns, we do get reports of human rights violations, because these shutdowns allow the governments to cover up such egregious violations against the people. You mentioned Sudan. In 2019, we saw what happened after the internet was turned back on. We received reports of horrendous human rights abuses against the people. In Belarus, which is the latest country in the news for shutting down the internet, we've also received reports of human rights violations in Belarus around elections. And one thing that we have noted is the fact that whenever the internet is shut down around elections, people tend to agitate and contest the credibility of the outcome of elections. And so these are some of the impacts that we are seeing across the globe. And I'm happy to dive the conversation to Pakistan, where Hija will be speaking to us about what's currently happening in Pakistan with regards to internet shutdowns and how people are coping with COVID-19 and other aspects of their lives in Pakistan. So Hija, kindly take the floor and give us a background of what's happening with regards to the internet shutdown that's happening in Pakistan and what you are noticing in the overall digital rights space in the country.
Thank you, Felicia, and thank you, Tomiwa and Yassine, to set up the floor for me, because when I was listening to both of you, I realized that all of the things that are happening in Africa, in Europe, and Africa, and also in this Asian region of the world, it definitely has direct human rights implications, and we do see it on ground as well. I have been engaging, my advocacy for the most part includes engaging with the communities on the ground and see how it affects them, how internet shutdowns affect them. Now, when I talk to, it's interesting because just last night I was conducting an interview with a journalist in Waziristan, which is an area in former FATA. I was talking to her, and she was basically sharing about how before COVID-19's lockdown, she was reporting from Waziristan to her media house, wherever she works. She told me that she had to travel around 5 to 6 hours one way to get to where she actually get access to the internet to send the report to her media house. Now this 5 to 6 hour one way, which is, which makes up to around 12 hours approximately per day, which is going for in her commuting only. And that also, she mentioned that it's not just a straight road. It's a road that is broken, that is not developed, because the entire region of Fata, former Fata, is underdeveloped and has not been given the attention that it should have been receiving from the authorities, because of the whole war on terror and how it still is considered as a sensitive area politically. Now, when I was talking to her, she shared a lot of other stories of people living in the region, in Waziristan and in other parts of other districts of Fata. She shares that one of the women she knew died because of not having internet access. She could not get medical help in time. She was going through labor, and because there was no internet access, there was no telephone access, and she did not have access to a mobile phone. What happened was basically she died in the process. And she says that there have been multiple instances of multiple similar instances where people have disproportionately affected. People have disproportionately, not just their healthcare, but also education, their work, and their employment opportunities, because these people already are living on the margins. They already have very limited avenues in terms of employment, education. Internet shutdown just adds to that damage. I was covering now, the internet has already been unavailable for the most part in that region, but the latest shutdown that we know of, that once the internet was available and then it was shut down, goes back in June 2016, when there was a clash on Pakistan-Afghanistan border between military forces. And as a result, of course, as we see around the world, the first line of action that the governments take in times of chaos is to shut down the internet. And that's what we saw there as well. And now, when situation has considerably improved, where you can say that life is coming back to normal, and as the journalist who I was talking to last night also shares, that situation has gotten better a lot compared to what it used to be a decade ago, but still the internet or connectivity to mobile phone or mobile connections still remain unavailable. Now, when we do strategic litigation around this, we saw that in 2018, Islamabad High Court's judgment basically said that internet shutdowns were illegal, and Pakistan Telecommunications Authority and the federal government cannot, shut down the internet because it affects freedom of expression and it affects people's right to information, etc. That, because it was already a very monumental judgment, it gave hope, but then again, it was challenged in the Supreme Court later by the Pakistan Telecommunications Authority, and its judgment came in April 2020, and the Supreme Court said that Islamabad High Court doesn't have the jurisdiction to comment or pass judgment on the matters of the federal government. Now, we continue to have internet shutdown. The status of internet shutdown still remain what it used to be. Like, Pakistan Telecommunications Authority and the federal government can still order internet shutdowns. Now, the interesting thing that Islamabad High Court's judgment mentioned, and the lawyers who were engaged in that case mentioned during the whole hearings, they mentioned that the order of internet shutdowns or mobile services suspension goes against what Telecommunication Act of 1996 entails, which basically is that internet shutdowns or mobile service suspension can only happen if there is a state of emergency, and the state of emergency has to be declared by the president. Now, when we see how internet shutdowns have been ordered, that is, on the resolution day, which is March 23rd, on, the Independence Day, which is August 14, or religious processions of Muharram, which is Ashura, and then Eid, events of Eid, and all of those events do see internet shutdowns, and we do not see any proof of these suspensions being actually doing what they are intended to do, which is to reduce the risk of terrorist attacks. This basically, how we see it, is an attempt for the government, and that's what the Supreme Court also said, that these orders are essential to ensure that security remains, and there's no threat to national security, because national security remains one of the only major excuse or major justification that the government has given in times whenever they want to suspend the internet, or whenever they want to suspend mobile networks in the country. Because Supreme Court had said that this is important for national security, we see it as basically discounting or relieving law enforcement authorities or security agencies of their responsibility to ensure that they take adequate measures to ensure that security is intact. Now, not the entire world is going through, is not experiencing internet shutdowns, but political upheaval is everywhere. And we see that wherever political instability is happening, authoritarian governments do take measures like network shutdowns. But again, like Yasin has mentioned, there is no protests cannot be stopped by network suspension. Similarly, political instability cannot stop by network shutdowns. What it does is spread chaos, spread misinformation. I have multiple examples of how it has affected. For example, I'll share an example from November 2017. There was a nationwide protest by an extremist political party in Pakistan as a result of a suggested amendment in the blasphemy law. Now, what should have happened is ensuring that internet is available to everybody, mainstream media is available to everybody, so authentic or credible information is reaching to everyone. But what the government did was suspended networks, censored mainstream media. And I was actually stuck in a very sensitive meeting, and I did not have access to Wi-Fi or my mobile phone for a couple of hours. And when I left that meeting, I realized that there's no network to connect to. There is no way I could get an information about what is happening right outside the door where I was. I was stranded for a couple of hours until mainstream media was back, until the networks were back to basically access authentic or credible information to plan my mobility accordingly. We see these examples of chaos and spread of misinformation during network suspensions very commonly in Pakistan. And I think I'll go back to what I said earlier. There is no proof of or no indication of network shutdowns actually indicating that they are promoting, or they are basically ensuring security or the intended purpose.
Thank you so much, Hija, for that. I remember in 2017, I attended FIF Africa, and I did mention that internet shutdowns cannot shut down people's voices. And this is something we are seeing. We saw what happened in Sudan. The people remained steadfast. They knew what they were fighting for. And despite the shutdowns, it made them motivated for them to actually go for what they wanted and to hold their governments accountable. And one funny thing is that governments tend to cite all kinds of reasons. None of them has been able to tell us that, okay, on this day or during this particular time when we shut down the internet, this is the problems that we were able to resolve because the internet was shut down. All we hear is numerous incidents of violations against the people, or it being used as a tool to shut people from speaking up against their leaders. And yeah, it's really sad. And at the same time, I'm happy to see that all of us here and many more people continue to push back against this repressive act that is being weaponized by governments around the world. And so I would let Dev highlight some of the work she's doing in India. The next session will be on the strategies that we are all using in our advocacy efforts. So you could speak more about what's happening in India, the impact of the shutdowns, and then yeah, you can highlight some of the work that you've done at Internet Freedom Foundation. And then once we get to the next section, we can highlight the strategies that we are all using to keep the fight ongoing. So over to you, Dev.
Thanks, Felicia. So currently, I'll just focus on the impact of internet shutdowns, and it's been very informative hearing Tomiwa, Yassine, and Hija talk, because I think there are lots of parallels to be drawn between the experiences of advocates who are working on this issue in this situation.
Sorry, Dev. I just want to inform our audience that if you have a question or a comment, kindly drop it in the chat button and we would respond to you once we receive them. So feel free to drop your questions or comments. Thank you. Sorry about that, Dev, you can go on.
Yes. So as I was saying, I think they've already mentioned a lot of things that I wanted to touch upon. So I'm going to try and keep this short and not repeat too much. But before I start, I think I want to acknowledge something, and this is something that even Tomiwa has touched upon. Even in India, there is fairly low levels of digital connectivity. So for instance, half of the Indian population just does not have access to the internet because there is either lack of adequate infrastructure or they don't have access to the correct devices. However, even in this kind of a system, or even when half of the population does not have access to the internet shutdowns are still a huge problem. Because as Tomiwa very insightfully said, and something that I hadn't really thought of before, there are a lot of people who depend on those who have internet connectivity for sustenance. So in that sense, there's a trickle-down effect whenever you shut down the internet, because there are people who have internet services who are supporting those who do not. So that's the first thing. And the second thing that I wanted to flag is, of course, we recognize that there's a difference between positive rights and negative rights. In this case, an internet shutdown is a violation of a negative right because there's active interference by the government with existing architecture. Whereas, in cases where people don't have digital connectivity because of lack of infrastructure or devices, there's a budgetary allocation that the government needs to make. So that's more in the nature of a positive right or a socioeconomic right, and therefore may not be as immediately enforceable as a negative right is. So I think it is in that context that we need to understand the problem of internet shutdowns and why they are so particularly egregious. Having said that, I think I'll talk a little bit about the impact that internet shutdowns have on different parts of society, be it healthcare, be it education, be it media or civil society. I think in India, something that we've realized is that we need to draw a distinction between two different types of shutdowns. Some shutdowns are fairly short and only last maybe a few hours or a day or two. Others, on the other hand, are very long and can last for months and even years, as we've now seen in the context of Jammu and Kashmir. But I think we need to recognize that even very short internet shutdowns are quite damaging to the health of any democracy, because what happens is that these short internet shutdowns are often imposed whenever there are any kind of anti-government protests. And this is something that Yassine has also explained previously. In the context of India particularly, we saw lots of states shutting down internet services when there were mass, these mass mobilization and protests against amendments to India's citizenship laws, which a lot of people feared would disenfranchise religious minorities. So I think when the government's able to, pull this kill switch and shut down all discourse in these crucial moments of a nation's history, that can be very, very damaging. On top of that, of course, longer internet shutdowns completely decimate the local economy. Estimates suggest that the harm that has been suffered by the economy of Jammu and Kashmir goes into billions of US dollars. So I really think we need to acknowledge that. On top of that, we've also, as part of the litigation that we've been doing at IFF relating to the Jammu and Kashmir internet restrictions, we've had the opportunity to talk to a lot of doctors, teachers, students, business persons, lawyers, journalists in Jammu and Kashmir, and sort of collect their first-person testimony and then produce these testimonies before the Supreme Court. The reason why this is extremely important is because the government will always come to court and say that, there is absolutely no negative adverse impact on COVID control or on healthcare and education, and everything is fine. So if you want to really challenge that very hunky-dory, all is fine picture that the government paints, you're going to have to produce some kind of evidence. And what we have found through these, interviews and collection of testimonies is that especially during COVID-19, the harm that's being caused by internet restrictions is very severe. So let me give you a couple of examples. The first and the most stark example, I think, is the impact that it's having on healthcare. So as all of us know right now, it's very difficult to go to a hospital because hospitals are so overburdened. They've become hotspots of infection. So most of us are relying on telemedicine services or e-pharmacy services as far as possible to minimize the existing loads on hospitals and labs and pharmacies. However, in Jammu and Kashmir, a lot of doctors have talked about how they cannot use telemedicine because currently mobile internet speeds are being slowed down to 2G. And at 2G speed, you can't do video conferencing. It's just not possible. We've had technical experts also swear on affidavit and point out that if you look at the minimum network requirements for Zoom, YouTube, etc., they're all well below 2G speeds. And as a doctor, you can imagine how difficult it would be for you to diagnose a patient who you can't see. As one doctor very helpfully pointed out, a lot of patients come to him and say something vague like, "Oh, doctor, I'm having pain in my tummy." But there are like tens of dozens of organs in the tummy. How is the doctor really supposed to figure out which organ, which part, is it swollen? Is there some kind of bruising, etc., right? So it's very important to be able to visually examine patients. That's one thing. The other thing that doctors have talked to us about is how they just cannot access information about not just COVID-19, but also other diseases. And the way this plays out is, for instance, one doctor very frustratedly told us about how he had to spend hours trying to download ICU guidelines. That is the kind of life-saving information we're talking about that is being denied to doctors and nurses and other healthcare workers. So that's a little bit about the impact that it's had on healthcare. In terms of education, it's really, really devastating because a lot of students that we've spoken to feel like they're being treated like second-class citizens. They feel like they're being denied the same opportunities that other students in India have. So for instance, we've recently had this month a lot of competitive exams for entrances to engineering, medical, and law schools. But students in Jammu and Kashmir can't really access all the course material. They can't really prepare for these exams because they don't have effective internet services. So these are two main things. I think people have already talked extensively about the impact that it has on journalists. And I would just like to point out that very recently, two journalists from Jammu and Kashmir, photojournalists actually, won the Pulitzer Prize for their reporting during the communication shutdown that was imposed last year. And when the communication shutdown was first imposed on 5th of August, even landlines were cut off. So we're not just talking about an internet shutdown, we're talking about landlines, SMS, phone calls, everything being shut down. And I can't even imagine what it must be like to be a photojournalist trying to do your job in those circumstances. What we heard is that during the complete communication shutdown, what journalists had to resort to is that they would transfer all their files onto a pen drive and then smuggle it out of Jammu and Kashmir through somebody who was maybe coming to Delhi or Mumbai or another city. And then it would be, sort of uploaded or published. So these are the kind of challenges that people in India have been facing because of internet shutdowns.
Thank you very much, Dev, for that brilliant submission. And let me check if we have any questions. Not yet, but those who just joined us, if you have a question, kindly drop it in the chat button, and we are happy to respond to them. This is the part I'm very interested in, and I will throw it to all of you. Any of you can respond. And I know some of you have mentioned some of the strategies that you're using to keep going, that keep you going. So we just want to dedicate this session for that. We have highlighted all the problems when it comes to internet shutdown, but I'm sure somebody will be asking, but why, or what is the secrets behind you being steadfast in pushing back against these repressive acts? And so tell us what your organization has been doing, and we want to know more about the strategies that you're using to push back against internet shutdowns. And I will let you go first, and then I can speak or capture some of the strategies that we use as the Keep It On Coalition as well. So any of you can respond.
Can I go for it? Okay. Just to preface my answer, and prefacing it means I'll tie it closely to what Felicia had mentioned, which I find super important. The problem is that African governments, especially in the region, they do not have enough trust capital to justify internet disruptions. And what I mean by trust capital is there is a huge disconnect between the rulership and the people being ruled. So whatever activity, especially something as crucial and defining as internet shutdowns, is always viewed with suspicion, especially on the part of the citizens. And the reason for that is, the evidence for that is, even after disruptions have occurred, we discover that governments, they are unable to articulate any positive post-disruption impact because it doesn't work in the first place. There's no justification for it. So in my view, some of the strategies, right, that could be adopted or that has been adopted in the past and has worked so far reasonably can be divided broadly into two, parts, the short term and long term. The long term, not so much, but the short term, we see a lot from organizations like Access Now and others that work around across the region. The short term is demand explanations. Why is an internet shutdown necessary at this point? This question definitely will lead to more important and other difficult questions they must answer, and at some point before government carry out disruptions. And at the center of this question, right, is the need to demand a proactive disclosure before an internet shutdown is carried out. So a government doesn't just wake up and say, or you as a citizen don't just wake up and discover that Facebook is no longer going through, or you can no longer access financial services, then be told after the fact that, oh, there's an internet shutdown going on. That is completely wrong and out of place. So before a government wants to carry out any form of restriction, especially on access, it must be explained. And that explanation definitely will give rise to other important and difficult questions that needs to be asked. Questions that would then begin to directly narrow the application of international human rights law. So when the government says, oh, we are showing access to the English-speaking part of Cameroon, advocates should be able to ask that, why the entire region? What is the problem you're facing there? And should you shut it down, does it resolve the problem? Because that also needs to be demonstrated. So that is one strategy that could be asked. People need to ask questions. But another strategy is that before people can ask questions, they need to know what they're asking questions about. And I think organizations like Access Now, like I mentioned earlier, is doing very well in that respect, especially in spreading literacy and spreading more information on these issues and how people can ask the important questions. Because the truth is, no one can do this alone. As organizations and civil society representatives and all of that, we still need people to get on board to be able to understand what is at risk. So number one, we need to ask questions. Number two, people also need to be carried along and informed of what the issues are. Then also utilization of human rights instruments. For example, from my perspective, from the African regional human rights perspective, I think there's a whole lot of work that is being done, several press releases, several resolutions that have been passed by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights on the need for countries to stop disrupting internet access, including internet access during the pandemic, right? There was a press release recently by the Special Rapporteur on freedom of expression and access to information, especially on COVID-19, and making specific reference to the Ethiopian shutdown and the one carried out in Guinea during the pandemic. So these documents do not necessarily exist to gather dust on shelves. They need to be actively utilized and used, the wording, the language used to approach government. The last thing I'm also going to speak about is collaboration, especially on the short-term aspect. It's collaboration because, like I said, organizations, researchers like you and myself, we cannot do it alone, right? And especially, and what I've also noticed in conversations like this is like one of the major stakeholders in this conversation is always missing, which is the government. And it shows you how the conversation is, getting more difficult because people who at the end of the day take these decisions are not even involved in, some of the conversations that try to shape these decisions. So you discover that most of the time the government they walk blind into these actions. So the human rights impact, the socioeconomic impact are not even they are not even fully and roundly considered before they are carried out. So that is also another issue that we need to completely to take on board and completely to utilize. We need to collaborate as stakeholders. On long term, I would like to include strategic litigation as a long-term initiative, right? Because litigation, as we know, is costly, especially depending on the jurisdiction. It's costly and it takes time, right? It takes time because of the processes, the judicial processes it involves. But at the end of the day, it always pays off, right? Whether it's in your favor or not, it sends a particular signal that someone is watching somewhere. And that, it sends a note that you can't just wake up and do anything you want, especially because you hold political power. That's one, on long-term strategic litigation. Secondly, I think this is a conversation that is really getting the traction it should. And the conversation is that we now need, more than ever, to develop a set of guidelines specific to internet shutdowns. That excuse that government continue to take or give that, they don't know what to do other than just shut down a broad and apply a broad policy or a broad shutdown to a conversation that needs to be streamlined and specifically applied. It needs to stop, because by the time we come up with such a comprehensive guideline that is publicly sourced, multi-stakeholder sourced, there will no longer be any excuse, right? But before even we can, that comes to fruition, the international law to a large extent is clear, even though not, not specific to the lines are not clearly spelled out, in respect to internet shutdown. So that also needs to be, we need to start having that kind of conversation, right? How do we develop a rights-based conversation on internet shutdowns so that this government and other actors stop giving excuses? So you do not say you do not know what to do when there's already a guideline that states this is how you carry out should that require any, even in the first place. And also the zero tolerance from the international human rights law community on internet shutdown should also reflect as much as possible in such a guideline that internet shutdowns are a no-no under any circumstances. But given the realities of the digital age that we live in, there are some very, very, very limited instances where such shutdown might be justified, as has been stated in a lot of human rights documents. But at the same time, those justification needs to be properly streamlined and be streamlined to specific instances and cases, and not just applied broadly and across board as most governments currently do. So that is my contribution on strategies.
Thank you very much for those brilliant recommendations. And I do agree with you totally on the strategies that you've mentioned, and collaboration you mentioned is key. And that is what the Keep It On Coalition seeks to achieve with the diverse actors in the space that we continue to engage on the Keep It On mailing list. And with regards to demanding explanations why internet shutdowns is the only option, I think that is also great. And one thing that we do as the Keep It On Coalition as well is to engage governments ahead of elections, because we do know that internet shutdowns are increasingly being used around elections to silence critiques. And so we do send open letters to governments highlighting the impact of internet shutdowns and the fact that leaving the internet on can actually help in the electoral processes by having active engagement or participation from the people, and also citing international human rights laws that condemn internet shutdowns as well. So awareness raising is key, both to governments as well as to individuals that are new to the topic. And then just strategic litigation is very, very crucial. And recently we saw positive rulings from the Jakarta court in Indonesia with regards to internet shutdowns that were ordered by the government in 2019. And then the ECOWAS court also ruled condemning shutdowns that were imposed in Togo in 2017. And these are important precedents that we want to see around the globe to ensure that the courts are speaking out against internet shutdowns. And one thing that we also realized was the fact that some of the judges or some of the judges did not have information about these shutdowns, their impact and all that. And so we do provide amicus briefs to highlight to give them more information about the impact of internet shutdowns on human rights, and back them with international laws that condemn internet shutdowns. And so briefly, I would let any of the other speakers come in to talk about strategies, and we keep the conversation going.
Okay, I'll just go for it. I was just hoping to build upon Tomiso's point of asking the right questions, because increasingly governments, through asking the right questions, through strategic litigation, they're being backed into a corner in terms of what justification they can use to use an internet shutdown. So for example, again, when you go back to Sudan, you saw that when the internet shutdown was implemented and that when other countries were calling the government out for the fact that it was violating human rights, the Sudanese government responded by stating that it was limiting human rights, which under international law you were able to do for purposes of national security. However, that was obviously, it wasn't justified in the circumstances because it was against anti-governmental protests. But what did bring an end to the internet shutdown was a case brought to the High Court by Abdulazim Hassan, which challenged the military government on the basis of contract law. So it found like an alternative way to challenge an internet shutdown outside the human rights framework. But now again, you see the problem recurring in Sudan with the use of shutting down the internet on the basis of school examinations, which again makes absolutely no sense when you have a myriad of different alternative, less restrictive measures. You could simply take away the phones of the students or so many different things. But what this indicates is it's an indication that the government is attempting to normalize the use of internet shutdowns, that if you can have a reason to shut down the internet, then they will use it. So what is very important is that you need to have these conversations, keep asking them on these justifications on why it's being implemented. And again, to touch on the ECOWAS decision, that was also a very important decision because it did just that. It specifically targeted the government's justification of national security for the reason for implementing the internet shutdown. The court held that there was no basis to shut down the internet because there was no security threat through protesting, through the internet, through the use of the internet. So it backs governments into a corner in terms of what justification they can use. So in terms of that, strategic litigation is very important, keeping the conversation going and the demand that a total prohibition of internet shutdowns is very important. On a more local level, my recommendation for what should be done to combat internet shutdowns is to not have it affect protests. And again, drawing from the lessons of Sudan, is due to once an internet shutdown is implemented, you have to maintain a non-violent stance. You cannot go into violence because that's what justifies an escalated response from the government. And even under the guise of an internet shutdown, you need to still maintain a level of organization. When the revolution was ongoing, you had the youth knocking door to door, telling people of protests, graffitis on the wall of a date and a place, graffiti on billboards. So you have these offline methods of connectivity that exist outside the internet that proves to the government that even without the internet, we will still keep protesting. And that would be very important, I think, for Belarus, where the protests are still ongoing under the guise of an internet shutdown. Another point would be at an international level is the increasing recognition of internet shutdowns as a form of collective punishment, as a war crime, because then that will open up so many more avenues at the international level to hold governments accountable. It creates the possibility of taking matters of internet shutdowns in relation to genocide, in relation to persecution or other war crimes or crimes against humanity to the ICC. You can then open up ad hoc tribunals specifically for internet shutdowns under international criminal law and humanitarian law, targeting individuals who are in charge of telecommunication companies. So in Africa particularly, you have a lot of overlap between military governments being in charge of telecommunication companies. So there's a direct link between the government, the military government, and telecommunication companies that work together to implement internet shutdowns. Now, the next question is, can you hold those individuals accountable under international criminal law? And I think that would be a very important development in the law if that were to happen, because currently you can't really enforce the implementation, the accountability of internet shutdowns at an international level, only at a local and a regional level. So it would be very important for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me allow Pija and Dev to come in as well to share with us some of the strategies, especially being in countries where internet shutdowns are also increasingly being used by the government. So Pija, any of you can go first.
Yeah, I'll go first. So I agree with what Tumiba and Yassine said in terms of awareness and in terms of also international pressure on the governments when it comes to internet shutdowns and accountability of the governments. One thing that I would like to mention here is the fact that in Pakistan specifically, internet is largely seen as a luxury. When we go in local communities, when we talk to people about internet or the rights that they have, we have to be very picky in terms of who we are talking to and whether they do have a working unrestricted access to the internet. It's not just, good quality, but also affordability that comes in. So there comes, a lot of times where people look at us as some crazy people who just want to talk about, these hypothetical rights that they have on a virtual virtual platform when they do not have access to, basic necessities like clothes, shelter, and food, etc. So when we talk about internet shutdowns, there is a massive information gap in terms of the rights. But when we see, although they do not see it as their basic right, but when we see at the stats that Pakistan Telecommunications Authority periodically puts out in terms of teledensity, in terms of internet penetration, we do see that access to the internet and access to mobile devices is constantly increasing. And while people do have access to the internet, but they do not have that awareness that is required when it comes to digital rights. So talking about digital rights or talking about access to the internet or internet shutdowns and why they matter and why the voices of people matter when it comes to countering internet shutdowns, we have to start from the very beginning and creating awareness among people about about the internet, their rights on the internet, and why access to the internet is important, and not just access but affordable and quality access to the internet. Strategies, as far as the strategies are concerned, what Media Matters for Democracy has been doing is we begin by including local communities in the discourse. We realize that whenever these discussions are being made about the internet, communities that are directly affected by these policies or by these orders that the federal government or provincial governments or the laws that they pass, these communities are not included in the discourse. So since last year only, we started engaging these local communities, which included, home-based workers, housewives, and, people who, working class, people from working class as well, because they do have access to the internet, but again, no awareness about their rights on the internet. So we included them and asked them the kind of internet they want. This was a whole campaign that we did and asked people the kind of internet they want. And what the first thing that came forward through these interventions was that they want affordable, quality internet, and internet that is unrestricted, and internet that does not just give up on them at any moment in time. One of the participants who we were talking to also mentioned that when mobile suspension happens around important events like Ashura or like during Independence Day or Resolution Day in March, they do face a considerable inconvenience, in the sense that they get disconnected from their families who are living abroad, because we do know that a lot of people go from here to the UAE for employment. People who work as laborers in construction industry in UAE, they do go there, and then when these events happen, their contact with their family members gets disrupted. So the concerns that we tried to address was, what do you want from the policymakers? And this was the first thing that came up. So awareness raising is something that we at Media Matters for Democracy take very seriously, and we understood that media plays a very important role in that, because we do see that these issues, for example, the two judgments that I mentioned in terms of internet shutdowns and the litigations that we have been doing in the past couple of years. One is Islamabad High Court's judgment, and the other that basically from the Supreme Court that said that Islamabad High Court judgment is redundant. We do understand that although these do get reported in the news in mainstream media, but they do not have the kind of nuance that they need. So we have this news website called the Digital Rights Monitor, where we collect all of these news around digital rights, and we add the value that the mainstream media lacks in terms of how it's going to affect the people who access the internet or who navigate online spaces. So we try to do that to raise awareness. And then of course there is strategic litigation. We support cases around freedom of expression, around internet shutdowns. We also document all of these instances in order to make sure that people are aware of the instances that are happening, and also the instances that that are not reported, because we also have people on ground that are sources on ground that are basically reporting all of the instances or human rights violations that are happening, or inconvenience, just mere inconvenience that people are facing in the wake of internet shutdowns. So we do try to do that on top of all the strategic litigation and also research initiatives that we take. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a few questions, so I would let us address them briefly, and then we move to Dev for her recommendations. So the first one is from Bernard, and he's asking, how can we foster collective efforts against internet shutdowns globally, especially across Africa, while ensuring security and protection of the rights of digital rights activists in repressive countries like Cameroon, Chad, etc. So Miwa, do you want to take that, Otherwise, I can go.
Yes. To start with, actually, there are no easy answers, right? But we can take a cue, for example, from what Access Now is currently doing, trying to rally as many voices as possible across the globe on the issue, what the issues are and how to approach them. Like I said earlier, approaching internet shutdowns does not necessarily have to be isolated, instances, right? Chad doesn't have to use a different approach, and India doesn't necessarily have to use a different approach. But nonetheless, we need to understand the place of context, and applying what human rights standards and what the issues are. So, in my view, like I said earlier, we can divide, approaching this internet shutdown in two broad categories. Like I said, short term. Short term could be, you can. There are several kinds of advocacy that could be adopted at that level. So, for example, you can name and at some point you can name and shame depending on the context, because sometimes when someone has a boot on your neck, you actually don't have many opportunities to be, for flowery words and all of that. Because sometimes that is exactly what internet shutdowns are. Because your life and your existence, for some weird reason, is completely shut off without no form of, warning and all of that. So we need to be able to, call out government. And also, I like the fact that you've specified the countries to African regions. We Africans also need to stop this deification of African governments. They are not teen gods. We put them there. And in some instances where they rig themselves into offices, we also need to be able to speak to government, right? They are not, that's our job. We need to be able to keep them on their toes. So we need to constantly demand and ask questions. And like I said, ask the right questions. Why do you want to shut down internet? And why should you shut down the internet after you, why are you informing us after you must have shut down the internet? What happened to proactive disclosure? So, and with the several examples we've always seen of, excuses of national security, what is the national security concern? Right? It is the culture of non-accountability that makes governments want to shroud, these issues under public order and national security. We need to be able to ask questions. These questions will point us directly to the next step we need to take. So if a government, like I said, was planning on doing a blanket internet shutdown, what makes you think this is justified? And according to international law, your action needs to be proportionate to the end you're trying to achieve. So if you shut down in a certain region, for example, how are you sure you are quelling the said disorder in that region? So it's a little bit not necessarily complex, but at the same time, like I said, we need to know what the context is, then begin to apply the legal standards to those contexts. I hope I'm able to, fairly attempt your question. Thank you so much.
With you, I think the shutdown in Cameroon was a wake-up call for all activists to know that the governments are capable of imposing such shutdowns for that long periods, and that has actually strengthened digital rights advocacy somehow in the region. And I do agree with you with the points you've mentioned. Documentation is also very important, highlighting countries that are shutting down the internet around the world, and any country that makes it to that infamous report that we produce annually should work harder to put an end to imposing internet shutdowns. There is another question to Tomiwa, says that litigation has resulted in some positive outcomes. Zimbabwe and Togo recently through the ECOWAS courts. What lessons can other countries take? I think I would let Dev respond here and use that opportunity to highlight how litigation has also been used in India to fight internet shutdowns.
Thanks, Felicia. I think Africa is definitely a continent that we look at as India when we want to draw some inspiration. And the reason why I say this is because I feel like Africa has a strong regional human rights system, unlike India. So in India, for instance, if the Supreme Court of India doesn't agree with you, there's really nowhere else you can go. You don't have an African Court of Human and People's Rights, or a European Court of Human Rights, or an Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So in that sense, I feel like India doesn't really have that kind of a regional or even international, how do I put it, a judicial forum that you can approach. Something that Yasin mentioned earlier, for instance, where he said that, maybe one day in future, internet shutdowns, which have been imposed in the context of, say, a crime against humanity or a genocide, could perhaps be prosecuted before the ICC. Another problem is that India is, again, not a party to the Rome Statute of the ICC. So that is something that's a constant source of frustration for me as an Indian human rights lawyer, because India doesn't seem to want to participate in the regional and international human rights ecosystem. And that's something amazing about Africa. And if if any of you would like to talk a little bit more about that after I'm done, I'd really like to learn more. In terms of purely litigation, I think I'd like to say two things. One is that we can't look at litigation in isolation. And this is something that I can tell you from my own experiences. Every day that we went to court to litigate the issue of like internet restrictions in Jammu and Kashmir, you could tell that the judges were reading newspapers, they were reading international statements coming from, major rights groups, they were reading condemnations by UN officials, etc. So that public environment that you create, where citizens are talking about it, where the international community is talking about it, that really helps to influence the outcome of what ultimately happens within the court. The other thing that I would say is that it's, again, as Tomiwa said, it's very important for us to ask our governments questions and get transparency. One way at IFF that we've tried to do that is by filing right to information requests. So India has a Right to Information Act, under which if you are to file a request with a government authority, they have to give you answers within 30 days. So we file these Right to Information requests with all state governments seeking copies of internet shutdown orders, but you can go even more granular. So for instance, right now in Kashmir, the government has agreed to restore 4G mobile internet connectivity in 2 out of the 20 total districts in Jammu and Kashmir. But we don't have any data about, for instance, what is the militancy levels or what is the terrorism threat in the other districts. So in that sense, they're not providing you any granular district-wise data, which helps you determine whether the restrictions are really narrowly tailored in a geographical sense. So getting all of this information also is very helpful in challenging the government's national security claim. So that's the other thing I wanted to mention. And finally, I think there's a lot of optimism about strategic litigation, but there's just one note of caution that I would like to sound. It's that it doesn't happen in this, one big sweep. It's more like a death by 1,000 cuts, where you're slowly trying to chip away at these laws, which are extremely old. Like, in fact, the Indian Telegraph Act, which is the main legislation under which the authority to impose internet shutdowns is sourced from, is an 1885 act. It was actually enacted by the British colonial government, and it is continued to be used by an Indian government, which really doesn't view its people as citizens, but still in some form as colonial subjects. So I think that's why it's very important for us to, get out of that old mindset and view people as full citizens, and rather than that, not as subjects. So those were just like some thoughts I had on strategy.
Thank you very much. We have a few minutes to wrap up. So I just want to go over some of the strategies that we've mentioned. There is a need for collaboration. We should be proactive. And our main aim is to prevent internet shutdowns. Where we are not able to prevent, we should be able to equip people with the right tools to be able to circumvent and continue their work during certain types of internet shutdowns. And we should continue measuring and monitoring internet shutdowns. That will give us the evidence that we can use to back arguments in court. And then we should continue assessing elections and internet shutdowns. And this is where we raise awareness about impacts of internet shutdowns and kind of sensitize governments not to shut down the internet during elections. We should raise awareness about shutdowns, that is telling the human impact of internet shutdowns, as we saw in the beginning of this session. Litigation is important. but it takes time. And so we should be patient, we should remain steadfast, we should be determined when we resort to using litigations to fight our governments or stakeholders that resort to shutting down the internet. And so there are more questions, but we do not have the time to respond. But I would want the speakers to close in. I'm giving each person 30 seconds, if that's possible, to give your closing remarks. So I would start with Yasin. 30 seconds, please.
Okay, sure. Just to wrap up, I think the most important point that I'd like to make is that we can't have the normalization of internet shutdowns. It is completely prohibited, and normalizing it would give unfettered powers to governments to limit as many critics, to limit protests, because the internet is the most important weapon civil society has today. Thank you.
Hija?
That's a lot of pressure. So the closing remarks that I would give are, so Pakistan has a very long way to go. And what I see right now is that there are a lot of challenges when it comes to internet shutdowns, challenging internet shutdowns. So definitely looking at all of your work around the world, how everybody is countering or challenging internet shutdowns in their countries and learning every day, because the challenges that we have in Pakistan are very unique, because everything, if we're countering anything that the government says, it's labeled as anti-state, military or anti-nation, and then you are bombarded with all of these FIRs and cases that you have to deal with. So I think I'm going to look forward to interacting with you more and see how we can collaborate. Yeah.
Thank you. And I like the fact that you ended with collaboration. Dev?
Since I only have 30 seconds, I'm going to end with a very cliched proverb, but I think it's a proverb that's very applicable, and that's the moral arc of the universe is very long and it bends towards justice, and largely because there are people who are constantly bending it in that direction. So I think it's important to just keep heart, have faith, even though it's painfully slow, it's very incremental, it takes time, and I know it's frustrating at times. But I think for me, something that's been incredibly nourishing has just been seeing that even though we haven't been able to fully get rid of internet restrictions in Jammu and Kashmir, and people are of course immensely still suffering there has been a change in status quo. We've gone from having a complete communication shutdown where even landline was not available to at least 2 out of the 20 districts now having full internet access, including 4G internet access. And we're optimistic that if we keep at this for perhaps several more months, it may even take years, there will be full and effective internet restoration in not just Jammu and Kashmir, but also in other parts of India where internet shutdowns are imposed.
Thank you. And last but not the least, Tomiwa?
Thank you so much, Felicia, for this. And also quickly, I would also want to toe the line of Dev, just to, there's a popular saying where I come from, and it's about collaboration. And don't take the saying literally. It's just take the message. And what it says is that when snakes slither together, they never get killed. The reason why snakes get killed is because they move one, separately. And what that means is collaboration. When people, advocates who are super strong about these issues, work together, collaborate, they are, there's been evidence. There are several opportunities and benefits that are associated with working together, aside from working in silos. So that would be my parting comment.
Thank you very much, Devduta, Yasin, Hija, Tomiwa, for your interventions. And thank you so much, CPESA, for giving us the platform to discuss this important topic. If you are a civil society organization that believes that the internet is an enabler of human rights, and you want to know more about the Keep It On Coalition and join us, kindly visit our website, www.accessnow.org, for more information on how to join this global campaign. Thank you very much once again, and have a lovely day.
Thank you, Felicia. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.